Well, Jim, our final question.
Are we ready to disappear?
We have one last question here this week.
Well, I got one last answer.
This was sent to CornyDriveThru@gmail.com from Gorilla Ventura in Montreal. And he says he's sorry about the Mets. Thank you, Gorilla. I recently reread Ric Flair's autobiography and was surprised by a comment he made about Randy Savage. Flair seemed underwhelmed by Randy's match with Ricky Steamboat at WrestleMania 3 and stated of Savage, quote, "Because of his unwillingness to just get in the ring and improvise, I won't call him a great worker." I know Savage liked to plot things out, so I could see why Flair might not appreciate his approach, but saying Savage wasn't a great worker seems absurd to me. I always thought being a great worker meant making the match look real, and Savage's stuff always looked real to me, especially when compared to the rehearsed matches we see today. What do you make of what Flair wrote?
Where can I go first? There's a difference between your work being good and being a good worker. And I'm not going to judge Rick's statement here just yet. I'm just going to try to delineate differences in people in wrestling when they say certain things a certain way. If your work looks good, then it looks real. You can't see through it. But at the same time, it's safe. If you're a good worker, that can be not only physical, but mental and psychological. Do you have good matches that bring the people on the fucking roller coaster ride? And
Jake.
Yeah, and you know, he was a good worker, even though there was little in his matches, and he was the furthest thing from the best athlete, but mentally and psychologically, he was the good worker. So you understand there's different things. With Flair, talking about Savage, yes, Randy Savage was a good worker. His shit looked good, and the personality, he was real. We've talked about it many times. He was real, and his shit was good, and it wasn't dangerous or reckless or whatever. But at the same time, Randy Savage was never put in the position where he was going to go out and travel the world in a variety of promotions and have a 30-minute match for the world title every night against a different person, some of whom you might not have met, and there wasn't a lot of prep time. That's where Flair's going. He could step in the ring with anybody, whether he knew him or not, whether he'd ever met him or not, whether they even shook hands until they locked up in the ring, and he could go 30 minutes and it would be a world title match. It would be a main event. Savage in the WWF was in a different place where he was, he's working with Hogan some, and that wasn't going to be 30 minutes or fucking hard-hitting or impromptu. But he also could work with the other guys like Steamboat, etc., when he wanted to. But where a lot of this comes from, maybe the majority of the ill feeling comes from, and it's hard to explain again today, but people have talked about it. Steamboat's talked about it. Savage knew that he and Steamboat had a chance to steal the show at WrestleMania 3, at least in terms of in the ring, even if they weren't going to have the big payoff like Andre and Hulk, even if they weren't going to be the main event, they could be what people remembered. And Savage sat down in his mind and worked out a match and wrote it down and gave it to Steamboat, and they studied it and quizzed themselves on it and went out and did it. And one of the reasons they did that was because how long did that match go? And it was long for WWF standards at that time, but was bell to bell, could it have been more than 15 minutes? Because nobody in those days got the chance, like in the NWA, like in Crockett, to go out and have a classic 30-minute world title match like Flair and Steamboat, whatever, or Flair and Wyndham, or etc. So Savage knew that he might have been able to call that whole match off the top of his head in the ring, but it would have taken longer because there would have had to have been times where you're down, you're in a headlock, calling something or planning your next strategy. But if they knew it ahead of time, they could go boom, boom, boom. And that's one of the reasons for the pace, because I think Steamboat, when he did the interview, said they had some ridiculous amount of false finishes, like 40 or whatever. And they remembered them all, and it boom, boom, boom. But This is what I was saying as far as people today may be, what in the world are you talking about? To write down your match ahead of time, to work it out in the locker room and already know what you were going to do before you went to the ring was probably not only a huge insult to anyone who considered themselves a great worker, but also just mind-blowing to any veteran of wrestling at the time that such a thing would take place. And I think that Flair wrote Savage off specific because they had never been in the same place when that Steamboat Savage match happened. I doubt they'd ever met each other. They'd never been in the same promotion. He probably wrote him off right there, and not knowing his background, not knowing what else Savage had to offer, what else was going on, just thought this fucking guy wrote his match down and planned it ahead of time, and they went out and did it according to notes. Fuck that. And honestly, I can't, blame that attitude at that time. That was just ridiculously unheard of. So that may have been what colored Flair's impression from then on of Randy Savage.
When did that start? I mean, he never did that with Lawler, did he?
No,
I know, that's what I'm saying.
You're fucking kidding? When Lawler was the booker, I've been in matches where my heels were wrestling Lawler, and 10 minutes in the match, he was still trying to decide on what he wanted the finish to be. You couldn't get Lawler to fucking quit playing cards before his main event where he'd sold out the Coliseum long enough to barely get the finish. And he said, I'll figure it out. And they always did. Everything with Lawler was impromptu. No, that started there. Savage Steamboat 3, or WrestleMania 3, Savage Steamboat was maybe some outlaw guys had done it somewhere. Every once in a while when I'd done the finish for the Midnight Express, I had something jotted down on a fucking Wendy's receipt in my shorthand just to remind myself of what I'd thought of in the back seat. But I remember hearing at the time that guys were talking when that happened, saying, yeah, they planned that match out. And everybody's like, what? So I don't know that on a mainstream big level promotion that had ever happened before like that. Maybe, if there was a situation where there was a celebrity or some pro football player or some big freak giant, somebody from outside the business, and they say, okay, this has got to be short and it's got to be exact and we can't let people see through this, then they had done something like that. But amongst two main event guys, I'd never heard of it before.
And of course, that influenced Dallas Page from when he worked with Randy Savage. He started scripting out all of his matches, and that did not go over with, let's say, The Undertaker when he handed him a script.
Yeah, because now it's Page coming from WCW to the WWF. It's not Randy Savage for the previous 3 years, one of the top fucking guys in the company. It's a guy coming from the opposition and handing the icon of the new company a fucking, I don't even think they were, Page would have been bizarre enough to call it a script. That word was banned in wrestling until it was taken over by outsiders. You never heard anybody use the word script. But just the idea that he would hand him notes on I came up with a match for us. Undertaker, what the fuck? Seriously? And I mean, even then in the 90s, you might go over it verbally if it's pay-per-view and your time is limited or big time TV or whatever. You go over it verbally, but to write it down and, et cetera, that was still very odd then. Now people, are like, well, why wouldn't you do that? Because it went against everything that the wrestling business was. So you had to get all the people out of the wrestling business that cared about what the wrestling business was before that could be a widespread procedure.
All right, Jim. Well, with that, let's get a few songs and get the hell out of here. This wild hair edition of this crappy show.
See, you warmed up to my name by the end of the show.
I had no choice.